listener production.
A series of crimes captivates and terrifies the community of Perth, Western Australia, over 2 decades. This is a powerful story about a community living in fear. It's a story about a massive police investigation and the eventual, long-awaited resolution that came with advances in forensic science. I'm Dan Mullins. This is Crime Insiders Judgment, a deep dive on a judge's final verdict of a crime and what transpired to incite that judgment. It's the mid-1990s in Perth, Western Australia. Claremont is a lively, affluent suburb, a popular destination for young people enjoying a night out. The streets are bustling with laughter and the sound of music spilling from the pubs and clubs. But for some, that night out would be their last. A shadow was about to fall over the city, one that would haunt it for more than 20 years. Between January 1996 and March 1997, 3 young women vanished from the Claremont area. First, there was Sarah Spears, a vibrant 18-year-old who disappeared after leaving a nightclub. Her body was never found. Then, just months later, Jane Rimmer, a 23-year-old childcare worker, vanished from the same street corner. Her body was discovered in bushland nearly 2 months later. And finally, in 1997, 27-year-old lawyer Ciara Glennon disappeared. Her remains were found a few weeks after she went missing. The disappearances and murders sent shockwaves through Perth. A sense of panic set in. Young women were warned not to walk alone, to stay in groups, to be vigilant. A serial killer was on the loose, and he was now known as the Claremont Killer. The Western Australian Police launched Task Force Macro, which would become the state's biggest, longest-running and most expensive investigation. They chased countless leads, investigated numerous suspects, and yet the case remained unsolved. The killer seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of grief and a community demanding answers. For years, the case went cold, but the investigation never truly ended. And as technology advanced, so too did the hope for a breakthrough. The key to unlocking the mystery was buried deep in the evidence from the crime scenes, specifically DNA and forensic fibers. A tiny piece of evidence, a fingernail clipping from one of the victims, held a secret. In 2016, a man named Bradley Robert Edwards was arrested. The police had a monumental case against him, built on decades of painstaking work. His DNA matched the sample found under Ciara Glennon's fingernails. Fibre evidence from his work uniform as a Telstra technician was found on both Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. The same distinctive fibres were also found on the body of a 1995 rape victim, a woman assaulted at Karrakatta, and a crime to which Edwards would eventually plead guilty. Edwards' trial was a marathon lasting over 6 months. In September 2020, Bradley Robert Edwards was found guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. While he was acquitted of the murder of Sarah Spears due to a lack of physical evidence, the judge stated it was more likely than not that he was involved. The verdict brought a sense of closure to a city that had lived with fear and uncertainty for so long. The Claremont serial killings are a somber reminder of a community's resilience in the face of tragedy and a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice. While the bodies of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon were found, the family of Sarah Spears still waits for a final answer, a final resting place for their daughter. The case may be closed, but the memory of the victims and the shadow of the Claremont Killer will forever be a part of Western Australian history. The investigation into the Claremont serial killings began in 1996 following the disappearance of Sarah Spiers. Detectives faced numerous challenges, including a lack of physical evidence and a growing public fear. Early leads included reports of an unidentified man seen in the area and the presence of an unknown vehicle, but these did not yield immediate results. The case garnered significant media attention, intensifying public pressure on law enforcement to make an arrest. Despite extensive efforts, including DNA testing and interviews with thousands of taxi drivers, the investigation initially yielded few breakthroughs. The disappearances of Sarah, Jane, and Kira devastated their families and the community, leading to widespread fear and a prolonged search for justice. A significant turning point in the investigation occurred over a decade after the first murder. Investigators discovered DNA under Kira Glennon's fingernails, which was later matched to Bradley Edwards. Additionally, forensic analysis of fibres from his work vehicle and a Sprite bottle found near one of the crime scenes provided further links to Edwards. Bradley Robert Edwards was arrested in December 2016 and charged with the murders of Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon, and later with the presumed murder of Sarah Spiers. The trial, which began in 2019, involved extensive forensic evidence, including DNA and fibre analysis, and testimonies from over 200 witnesses. The defence contested the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination or misinterpretation. However, the prosecution argued that the cumulative evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Edwards as the perpetrator. In December 2020, Edwards was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 40 years. One of his other victims, who was 17 when viciously raped by Edwards, told his trial he was, quote, the definition of a coward. The woman, known in the trial as the Karrakatta victim named after the area where the attack occurred, said, "He preyed on weak, vulnerable young women who didn't stand a chance. How pathetic. It has been much easier in terms of impact to realize there was no evil genius at work here. He slipped through the cracks because he is unremarkable. And now I will leave this behind. I will leave this courtroom and finally go and live my life without you in it. I will live it joyously, respectfully, and gratefully for myself, my family, and for the lives that were lost. I will live, and you won't. And as one of the victims of your crimes, I hope you are treated as well in prison as you have treated us." Coming up, word for word, the judgment as it was read in court. Justice Stephen Hall addressed the Western Australian Supreme Court in his closing remarks at the end of a 7-month trial. He said, "This is a trial like no other. This is a trial like every other. Those apparently irreconcilable statements are both true. It's a trial like no other because of the combination of its length, its size, and the high degree of public interest. The events in question occurred more than 20 years ago, but have haunted the memory of many people and troubled the public conscience. The disappearance and likely murder of 3 young women was in itself enough to cause wide concern. The fact that all 3 went missing from a popular nightlife area frequented by many young people inspired a real and pervasive sense of fear. Whilst courts are almost always open to the public, this is often little more than a platitude. In this case, attendance during the trial was strong and sustained. Further publicity both before and during the trial was significant. Multiple reporters from various media outlets attended every day. Few trials have been so consistently reported or reported on in such detail. Scarcely any witness passed through the court without being the subject of comment. The axiom that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done, was never more apt. Over many years, enormous resources were dedicated to the investigation on this matter. Vast quantities of evidence were obtained and witnesses interviewed. That has resulted in an unusually lengthy and detailed prosecution case. Prior to the trial, there were 14 pre-trial hearings over 19 sitting days. The prosecution brief consisted of 178 lever arch files in 44 boxes. The electronic version of the prosecution brief occupied multiple terabytes of computer database space. There were 95 trial sitting days over 7 months, 10,828 pages of transcript, 240 witnesses who either were called or had their evidence read, and 2,879 exhibits. But this is a case like every other, because despite the unusual features I've referred to, the fundamental principles that apply to every criminal trial apply to this one. The courts do not deliver different standards of justice. Justice is dispensed without fear or favour, affection or ill will. The promise of equal justice before the law required that this trial, like all criminal trials, be conducted with care to ensure fairness to both the defence and the prosecution. The accused is presumed innocent. The state bears the onus of proof, and the standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. Those principles are unqualified, immutable, and uniform in their application. I have not been distracted by the public interest or the publicity from the proper application of those principles. Also, like every other criminal case, it involves the lives of real people. Whatever interest others may have, a criminal trial is not a performance put on for either their edification or entertainment. The victims were real people who had families that loved them and who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Also, as in every criminal case, there is an accused person who stands charged with serious offences and whose fate depends critically on the outcome of this trial. He, like every other accused person, is entitled to a fair trial conducted according to law. The accused, Bradley Robert Edwards, is charged with willfully murdering Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. In order to be guilty of such a charge, it must be proven beyond reasonable doubt that the accused killed the named person, that the killing was unlawful, and that the accused intended to cause death. Sarah Spears was last seen in Claremont in the early hours of the morning of 27 January 1996. She was an 18-year-old secretary. She has never been seen again, and there has been nothing to indicate that she is still alive. Though her body has never been found, the only reasonable conclusion is that she is dead. Jane Rimmer was last seen in Claremont just after midnight on the 9th of June 1996. She was aged 23 years old and was employed as a childcare worker. Her body was located on the 3rd of August 1996. Ciara Glennon was last seen in Claremont just after midnight on the 15th of March 1997. She was aged 27 years old and was employed as a solicitor. Her body was located at Eglinton on the 3rd of April 1997. I'm satisfied that the evidence establishes that each of the victims was abducted and killed. The real question is the identity of the killer or killers. In particular, the question in respect of each count is whether it has been proven beyond reasonable doubt that the accused is the killer. The evidence of identity is circumstantial evidence and in particular, forensic evidence relating to DNA and fibres. In order to prove the guilt of the accused, that evidence must be capable not only of supporting an inference that the accused was the killer in each case, but also of excluding any reasonable possibility that anyone other than the accused could have been the killer. That evidence is strongest in respect to the killing of Ciara Glennon. There is also some forensic evidence in respect of the identity of the killer of Jane Rimmer. However, in the case of Sarah Spiers, there is no forensic evidence at all. There are two suggested courses of reasoning in respect of each charge. In respect of Ms. Glennon and Ms. Rimmer, the first course of reasoning is to determine whether similarities between their cases justifies a conclusion that they were killed by the same person. If that conclusion is reached, to then rely on evidence from both cases to determine the identity of that killer. The second course of reasoning is to look at Ms. Glennon's case first, and if the identity of her killer is proven, to then use that as propensity evidence in respect of the other charges. This course of reasoning would then turn to the case of Ms. Rimmer to determine whether the evidence in that case, together with the propensity evidence, establishes the identity of the killer. In respect of Ms. Spiers, the first course of reasoning is to determine whether similarities between her case and that of the other two justifies a conclusion that they were killed by the same person, and to then rely on evidence from all three cases to determine the identity of that killer. The second course of reasoning is to use proof of the other cases as propensity evidence and to then consider whether that evidence, together with that relating specifically to Ms. Spiers, establishes the identity of her killer. I've prepared detailed reasons for the conclusions I've reached. This summary forms part of those conclusions. In respect of Ms. Glennon and Ms. Rimmer, I've reached the following conclusions as to the first course of reasoning. 1. There are significant similarities between the circumstances of their disappearances and deaths. These similarities are A. Both Ms. Rimmer and Ms. Glennon were young women. B. Both attended venues in the Claremont area to socialise with friends and were last seen in that area before leaving on their own. C. Both went missing in the early hours of a weekend morning. D. Both went missing within a 9-month period from June 1996 to March 1997. E. In both cases, they were killed in a similar manner, that is, by a sharp force injury to the neck. F. In both cases, there were defensive wounds indicating they had sought to defend themselves from an attacker armed with a sharp weapon. G. The bodies of both women were deposited in semi-rural locations on the outskirts of the city. H. The positioning of the bodies and the covering of them with plant material from surrounding vegetation. And I. Both had fibres on them that were consistent with them having been in a V.S. Holden Commodore car that was habitually used by a Telstra employee. Those similarities establish beyond reasonable doubt that the same person killed both Miss Rimmer and Miss Glennon. 3. The evidence as to the identity of the killer includes the DNA evidence, the fibre evidence, and the propensity evidence. Of these, the DNA evidence is critical to the prosecution case. I'm satisfied that the evidence establishes beyond reasonable doubt that the DNA of the accused was under the nails of Miss Glennon, the left hand of Miss Glennon, and that it got there in the course of a violent struggle that occurred some time before her death. 4. The fibre evidence establishes that each of Miss Rimmer and Miss Glennon were in a V.S. Holden Commodore car that was habitually driven by a Telstra employee in the short time before their deaths. I'm also satisfied that the accused drove such a vehicle at the relevant times. 5. The propensity evidence of the Karrakatta incident, which is the only propensity incident that I have relied on for this purpose establishes that the accused had a tendency to violently attack and abduct young women from the Claremont area. 6. Having regard to the DNA evidence, the fibre evidence and the propensity evidence, I am satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the accused was the killer of Miss Rimmer and Ms. Glennon. And 7. The circumstances of the abductions and the nature of the wounds inflicted proves beyond reasonable doubt that the accused intended to kill each of Miss Rimmer and Miss Glennon. The second course of reasoning in respect of Miss Rimmer and Miss Glennon leads to the same ultimate conclusions. Applying that course of reasoning, I draw the following conclusions. 1. That Miss Glennon was last seen in Claremont in the early hours of the 15th of March 1997. 2. When last seen, she was in the vicinity of a white VS Holden Commodore. 3. That Miss Glennon was killed by a person wielding a sharp instrument and inflicting a fatal injury or injuries to the neck. 4. That it has been established beyond reasonable doubt that the DNA of the accused was under the nails of Miss Glennon's left hand, and that it got there in the course of a violent struggle that occurred sometime shortly before her death. 5. The fibre evidence establishes that Miss Glennon was in a VS Holden Commodore car that was habitually driven by a Telstra employee in the time shortly before her death. I'm also satisfied that the accused drove such a vehicle at the relevant time. 6. The propensity evidence of the Karrakatta incident, which is the only propensity incident I have relied on, establishes that the accused had a tendency to violently attack and abduct young women from the Claremont area. 7. Having regard to the DNA evidence, the fibre evidence and the propensity evidence, I'm satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the accused was the killer of Miss Glennon. The circumstances of the abduction and nature of the wounds inflicted proves beyond reasonable doubt that he intended to kill Miss Glennon. Ms. Rimmer was last seen in Claremont in the early hours of the 9th of June 1996. Miss Rimmer was killed by a person wielding a sharp instrument and inflicting a fatal injury or injuries to the neck. The fibre evidence establishes that Ms. Rimmer was in a VS Holden Commodore station wagon that was habitually driven by a Telstra employee. In the time shortly before her death, I'm also satisfied that the accused drove such a vehicle at the relevant time. Justice Hall then applied the same rigorous assessment to the case of Sarah Spears, finding it likely that Edwards was her killer, but unable to find him guilty. He then delivered his judgment. He said, "Stand up, please, Mr. Edwards. On count 6, that on or about the 27th of January 1996 at Claremont and elsewhere, you willfully murdered Sarah Ellen Spears. My verdict is that you are not guilty. On count 7, that on or about the 9th of June 1996 at Claremont and elsewhere, you willfully murdered Jane Louise Rimmer. My verdict is that you are guilty. On count 8, that on or about the 15th of March 1997 at Claremont and elsewhere, you willfully murdered Kira Eilish Glennon. My verdict is that you are guilty. You can sit down. I entered judgments of conviction on counts 7 and 8 and a judgment of acquittal on count 6. At sentencing, Justice Hall told Edwards, I recognize that there is a high likelihood that you will die in prison. You were a dangerous predator who sought out vulnerable young women and attacked them for your own gratification. You targeted unsuspecting women who were usually completely unknown to you. Your actions were premeditated, executed with pitiless determination, and you were remorseless in your disregard for the pain and suffering that you caused. By your actions, you robbed the victims of their lives, their hopes, their dreams, and the dreams others had for them. For parents, the death of a child is always an unspeakable tragedy. To have a child taken and killed in the prime of their life is every parent's worst nightmare, and the effects are profound and long-lasting. The then Western Australia Police Commissioner Chris Dawson held a press conference outside the court and said police would not give up on trying to solve Sarah Spears' murder, and said the quest for justice for Sarah will continue. Edwards was handed a life sentence with a non-parole period of 40 years, the longest ever non-parole period in WA judicial history. Commissioner Dawson said, "I think it reflects the severity and gravity of the crimes." Thanks for listening to Crime Insiders Judgements. We love hearing your feedback, so please rate and review this episode. If you have a case you want us to cover, let us know via Instagram at Listener Crime or TikTok at Listener Crime Team. I'll be back again next Thursday with another case. I'm Dan Mullins, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.